The first offer sounded impossible. That was exactly why most people accepted it. Margaret Hale remembered the silence that followed the announcement. Not confusion, not skepticism. Silence. The kind that happens when people suddenly realize they might become wealthy. The representative stood at the front of the county meeting hall wearing a tailored suit and an expensive smile. Maps covered the wall behind him. Survey lines, property boundaries, railroad routes, expansion plans, everything. The room remained packed with farmers, ranchers, landowners, families whose names had been tied to the county for generations. The representative pointed toward the map. The company is prepared to offer double current market value. Silence. Then somebody laughed. Then somebody else. Not mocking laughter. Disbelieving laughter. Because nobody paid double. Not for farmland. Not for pasture. Not for anything. The representative smiled. We want voluntary agreements. The room erupted. Questions came from every direction. How soon? How much? What acreage? What timeline? Everything. Margaret sat quietly near the back. Listening. Watching. Thinking. The Hale farm appeared directly in the center of the proposed route. A problem. A very large problem. The farm sat on rolling Missouri ground overlooking a river valley. Not the biggest operation in the county. Not the most valuable. But important. Very important. At least to Margaret. The property originally belonged to her grandfather, Samuel Hale, a stubborn man who viewed land differently than most people. One summer evening when Margaret was 13, she followed him along a fence line overlooking the lower pasture. The setting sun painted everything gold. Samuel stopped, pointed toward the valley. See that? Margaret nodded. The pasture? No. Long pause. Then, the river. Samuel smiled. No. She frowned. Then what? He looked across the entire property. The fields. The timber. The hills. Everything. Then answered. Options. At 13, the answer made no sense. At 38, it meant everything. Because Samuel never viewed land as acreage. He viewed it as opportunity. The farm wasn't especially large, but it contained something unusual. River access. Timber. Pasture. Crop ground. Gravel deposits. Multiple water sources. Everything in one place. Most people saw a farm. Samuel saw possibilities. That lesson stayed. Years later, after Samuel passed away, Margaret inherited the property, along with notebooks, maps, survey records, handwritten observations spanning decades. Everything. Most people would have ignored them. Margaret read every page. One particular notebook mentioned transportation repeatedly. Road access, river access, future rail corridors, economic movement. The entries felt strange at first, until she realized Samuel spent years studying how value moved. Not just crops, not just cattle. Value. The distinction mattered. The railroad announcement brought those memories back immediately. Meanwhile, the county celebrated. Naturally. At the diner the next morning, people looked happier than she'd seen in years. Dale Harper nearly floated through the door. Best news this county ever got. Rick Harlow nodded. Absolutely. Another farmer grinned. I already know what I'm buying. Laughter spread through the room. Margaret drank coffee quietly. Then Dale noticed. You don't seem excited. She smiled faintly. I haven't decided yet. Silence. The table froze. Then, what? Margaret shrugged. I said I haven't decided. Dale blinked. It's double market value. Yes. Long pause. What's there to decide? Margaret looked out the window, then back. Maybe that's the question. That answer irritated Dale immediately. As usual, over the next 3 months contracts started arriving. One by one. Then faster. Survey crews appeared. Lawyers appeared. Appraisers appeared. Everything moved quickly. Very quickly. The railroad company clearly wanted momentum. And momentum worked. The first farmer signed. Then another. Then another. Within weeks, entire sections of the proposed route were secured. The money proved difficult to resist. Because many farms struggled. Equipment loans. Operating costs. Weather risks. Market volatility. Double market value solved many problems. One evening, Emily Hale sat across from Margaret at the kitchen table. Offer documents covered every available surface. Maps. Contracts. Appraisals. Everything. Emily looked around. You're doing it again. Margaret looked up. What? The maps. Silence. The maps. That means you're thinking. Long pause. Then. Yes. Emily sighed. Dangerous. Very dangerous. What kind of thinking? Margaret pointed toward the survey documents. The route. Emily immediately looked nervous. Railroad thinking? Margaret nodded. Yes. That didn't help, because railroad thinking usually led somewhere unusual. The next week, company representatives arrived. 2 men. Polished boots. Pressed shirts. Professional smiles. They walked the property with Margaret for nearly 3 hours. Taking notes. Asking questions. Reviewing boundaries. Everything. Finally, they stopped near the river overlook. One representative smiled. Beautiful land. Margaret nodded. Yes. Long pause. Then, you've received the offer? Yes. And silence. Margaret looked toward the valley. Then back again. I haven't decided. The smile disappeared slightly. Only slightly. But enough. May I ask why? Long pause. Then, what's the hurry? The men exchanged glances. Never a good sign. The representative recovered quickly. Progress. Margaret nodded. Whose? That answer ended the conversation faster than expected. Over the next several weeks, something strange happened. Everybody sold. Everybody. The Wilsons sold. The Parkers sold. The Hendersons sold. The Millers sold. Every property along the proposed line changed hands. One by one. Until only one remained. The Hale farm. The county couldn't understand it. Neither could the railroad. One afternoon, Dale Harper drove directly into Margaret's yard. He climbed out before the truck fully stopped. No. Margaret looked up from a fence repair. Afternoon. Dale pointed dramatically. No. Silence. What? The railroad. Long pause. What about it? You haven't signed. Margaret nodded. Yes. Dale stared. Then stared longer. Then. Why? She looked toward the hills. Then toward the river. Then back at him. Something feels wrong. Silence. Absolute silence. Dale folded his arms. That isn't an answer. Margaret smiled slightly. Maybe it is. The problem wasn't the money. Everyone assumed it was. It wasn't. The offer genuinely was generous. Remarkably generous. Which bothered her. Because companies rarely became generous without reasons. Especially large companies. One rainy afternoon, Margaret pulled out Samuel's notebooks again. Transportation maps. Survey records. River studies. Economic projections. Page after page. Then she found something. One handwritten note. Short. Simple. Underlined twice. Always ask why they're willing to pay more than something is worth. Margaret stared at the sentence. Then looked at the railroad maps. Then back at the notebook. Then at the maps again. Slowly. A question formed. A very uncomfortable question. The next morning she drove to the county records office. And by sunset, she understood why the railroad was moving so fast. And why everyone else had already signed. Because the land wasn't the real prize. And suddenly, Margaret Hale became the only farmer left on the entire route who refused to sell. The county records office closed at 5. Margaret left at 4:58. And for the first time since the railroad announcement, everything made sense. Not all of it, but enough. Enough to understand why the company moved so aggressively. Enough to understand why they paid double market value. Enough to understand why they wanted signatures before people started asking questions. The railroad wasn't buying farmland. Not really. The farmland simply happened to sit on top of something far more important. Transportation. Access. Control. The proposed line connected 2 major freight corridors. One east. One west. And directly beside the Hale property sat the only practical location for a future switching yard and distribution hub. A very large one. The kind capable of handling millions of dollars in freight every year. The railroad documents never mentioned it publicly, but the planning records did. Buried deep inside permit filings. Infrastructure studies. Future expansion projections. Everything. Margaret sat in her truck overlooking the valley, thinking. Because suddenly Samuel's notebooks made perfect sense. Always ask why they're willing to pay more than something is worth. The next morning the railroad representatives returned. This time they seemed less relaxed. Less patient. The first man smiled. But the smile looked forced. We understand you still haven't signed. Margaret nodded. Yes. Long pause. Then, can I ask a question? The men exchanged glances. Of course. Margaret unfolded several documents. Then placed them on the table. Silence. Absolute silence. Because both representatives recognized them immediately. Transportation studies. Expansion plans. Switching yard proposals. Future freight estimates. The smile disappeared completely. Margaret looked at them calmly. So, long pause. How much is the distribution yard worth? Nobody spoke. For several seconds. Then the older representative leaned back. The conversation changed instantly. Because now everybody understood something important. Margaret wasn't guessing. She knew. The railroad increased the offer that afternoon. Substantially. The county nearly lost its mind. Dale Harper arrived before sunset. Naturally. No. Margaret looked up from the porch. Evening. Dale pointed toward the house. No. Long pause. What? They raised it. Yes. Again. Yes. Dale stared. Then. How much? Margaret told him. Silence. Then more silence. Then. No. She smiled slightly. Yes. Dale sat down heavily. Because the number sounded ridiculous. Life-changing. Generational. The kind of money farmers dreamed about. And still, Margaret refused. The county couldn't understand it. Neither could most of her friends. Even Emily struggled. One evening they sat overlooking the lower pasture while sunset painted the valley gold. Emily looked toward the river. Then toward Margaret. Can I ask something? Margaret nodded. Always. Long pause. Are you sure? Silence. Wind moved through the grass. The cattle grazed below. The river reflected orange light. Everything felt peaceful. Then Margaret answered. No. Emily frowned. No. Margaret smiled. Nobody's ever sure. Long pause. Then why keep saying no? Margaret looked across the valley, toward the exact location marked on the railroad plans. Then back again. Because I think they're still buying it too cheaply. The next offer arrived 3 weeks later. Higher again. The company disguised it as goodwill. Cooperation. Respect. Margaret recognized desperation. The distinction mattered. Because businesses rarely keep raising offers unless something valuable remains unavailable. Months passed. Construction started on neighboring properties. Survey stakes appeared. Equipment arrived. The railroad expanded around the Hale farm. Around it. Not through it. The entire project developed a strange shape visible from the air. One missing section. One holdout. One farm. The Hale place. Investors started asking questions. Executives started asking questions. Lawyers started asking questions. Eventually, a senior vice president arrived personally. A man who normally negotiated deals worth hundreds of millions. Yet there he stood, on Margaret's porch, looking tired. Very tired. He stared across the valley for several moments. Then spoke. You know this isn't personal. Margaret nodded. I know. Silence. Then. Most people would have sold. She smiled slightly. Yes. Long pause. Why didn't you? The answer surprised him. Because it wasn't about money. Not really. Margaret pointed toward the valley. My grandfather spent 50 years understanding this property. The executive listened. He taught me something. Silence. Then. What? Margaret looked toward the river. The most valuable thing isn't always what's visible. The executive stood quietly. Because deep down, he understood exactly what she meant. 6 months later, negotiations finally ended. Not because Margaret surrendered. Because both sides reached an agreement neither originally expected. The railroad purchased only a limited section of the property. A carefully negotiated section. Far smaller than originally planned. Meanwhile, Margaret retained ownership of the most strategic acreage surrounding the future distribution hub. The company got its rail line. Margaret kept control of the land that would matter most afterward. The county didn't understand immediately. Most people assumed she'd finally given in. Until 3 years later. That's when everything changed. The distribution hub opened. Then expanded. Then expanded again. Warehouses appeared. Trucking companies arrived. Equipment suppliers followed. Manufacturing businesses followed them. Property values exploded. Not gradually. Violently. Land surrounding the hub became some of the most sought-after commercial acreage in the region. And Margaret owned a lot of it. A lot. One by one businesses approached her. Warehouse developers. Equipment companies. Storage operators. Distribution firms. Everyone needed access. Everyone needed space. Everyone needed the exact land she still controlled. One autumn afternoon, Dale Harper stood beside her overlooking the valley. Only now the view looked different. Modern warehouses stood where empty fields once existed. Freight trains moved steadily through the hub. Truck traffic flowed constantly. Economic activity filled the valley.